The whispering trees. The trees seemed to whisper my forest encounter. I've always been an avid hiker, spending most weekends exploring the trails around my hometown. Nothing unusual ever happened until last month, when I decided to try a new trail in Blackwood Forest. It was a crisp autumn day, perfect for hiking. The trail wasn't particularly challenging, but it was less traveled than the popular routes. About 2 hours in, I decided to take a short break. I found a fallen log, sat down, and took out my water bottle. That's when I first noticed it. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the leaves. But as I sat there, I realized there was something different about the sound. It wasn't random or natural. It had a cadence to it, almost like hushed conversations. I stood up, thinking maybe there were other hikers nearby. "Hello?" I called out. My voice seemed to die in the air, absorbed by the dense foliage. No one answered, but the sound stopped momentarily. Feeling a bit uneasy, I decided to continue my hike. As I walked deeper into the forest, the sounds returned. They seemed to follow me, always just at the edge of comprehension. I couldn't make out words exactly, but there was an unmistakable rhythm to it, like speech, but not quite human. I tried recording it on my phone, thinking maybe I could analyze it later, or at least prove to myself I wasn't imagining things. When I played it back right there on the trail, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing and footsteps. But I could still hear the whispering around me, clear as day. By mid-afternoon, the whispering had become more insistent. It no longer sounded like it was coming from a distance, but from the trees themselves, right next to the trail. I began walking faster, wanting to finish the loop and get back to my car. That's when I noticed something odd about the trees. In this particular section of the forest, they all seemed to be leaning slightly inward toward the trail. Their branches stretched out in unusual patterns, almost like reaching hands. I'm not a superstitious person, but I felt a deep sense of being watched. Not threatened exactly, but observed, studied. The whispering grew louder when I stopped and seemed to quiet when I moved, like the forest was commenting on my actions. At one point, I distinctly heard what sounded like my name. Just once, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I took out my phone to call a friend, but there was no signal. I practically jogged the last mile back to the trailhead. The relief I felt when I saw my car was immense. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the forest entrance. The trees stood still and silent, giving no indication of what I'd experienced. I've talked to a few local experts since then. One mentioned that certain atmospheric conditions can create sound distortions in forests, especially ones with specific tree species and density. Another theory was that I had stumbled upon a natural amphitheater of sorts, where sounds from miles away might be carried and distorted. These explanations make sense, but they don't fully account for what I heard. The deliberate nature of the sounds, the patterns, the way they seemed to respond to me, it wasn't random noise being distorted. I've gone back twice since then, once with a friend. The first time I heard nothing unusual. The second time, my friend heard nothing, but I caught faint whispers as we were leaving, just at the edge of my hearing. There's one thing I haven't told anyone else. The night after my first hike, I had a vivid dream of those trees. In the dream, they were trying to tell me something important, something urgent. I woke up with a single phrase in my mind, though I have no idea what it means. The roots remember. I'm going back this weekend. This time I'm bringing better recording equipment. I need to know if I'm losing my mind, or if there's something in those woods that science can't explain yet. The Lost Trail. I got lost on a familiar trail, and what I found is baffling. I've been hiking the Pinecrest Trail for nearly 7 years now. It's a moderate 6-mile loop that winds through the eastern part of the state forest. I know every twist and turn, every distinctive boulder and fallen tree. At least I thought I did. Last Tuesday, I took a day off work for some much-needed outdoor time. The weather forecast was perfect. Cool but sunny, not a cloud in sight. I packed light, just water, some trail mix, and a light jacket tied around my waist. I didn't even bring my full first aid kit, just a few bandages in my pocket. That's how confident I was. Why wouldn't I be? I'd hiked this trail dozens of times before. I started at the main trailhead around 9 a.m., The first 2 miles were exactly as I remembered. The path climbing gently through a stretch of pine trees, then opening up to a series of rocky outcroppings with a view of the valley below. I stopped there briefly to have some water, feeling completely at ease. It was after the halfway point, past the old wooden bridge, that things started to feel off. There's a distinctive split in the trail there, with the main path continuing straight and a smaller side trail breaking off to the right. I always stay on the main path, which loops back to the trailhead. But this time, something strange happened. I'm still trying to make sense of it. I followed the main path as always, but after about 10 minutes, I noticed the trees were different. Instead of the mix of pines and oaks I was used to, I was suddenly in a dense grove of birches. Their white trunks stood out starkly against the forest floor, like pale sentinels. I stopped, confused. There is no birch grove on the Pinecrest Trail. At least, there never had been before. I thought maybe I had absent-mindedly taken the side trail without noticing, so I turned back. But after walking for what should have been enough time to reach the split again, I found myself in completely unfamiliar territory. The trail itself looked well maintained, which was reassuring. This wasn't some abandoned path, but it wasn't my path. The ground began to slope downward more steeply than any part of the Pinecrest Trail, and I came across a small stream cutting across the path, a feature I had never seen before. I checked my phone, hoping to use GPS to orient myself, but there was no signal. My watch showed it was already 1 p.m. I had somehow lost track of time. What felt like 20 minutes of walking had apparently been over 2 hours. Not wanting to admit I was lost, I decided to keep following the trail, assuming it would eventually connect back to a known path or lead to a road. The forest grew denser, and the quality of light changed, filtering through the leaves in a way that made everything look slightly wrong, too green, too vibrant. That's when I noticed the cairn, a stack of 5 flat stones balanced carefully beside the trail. I definitely didn't remember that from previous hikes, but it was clearly man-made. It gave me hope that I was on a legitimate trail that would lead somewhere. A few hundred yards later, there was another cairn, and then another. They appeared every few minutes of walking, like breadcrumbs leading me forward. I followed them, grateful for these signs of human presence. After what felt like another hour, the trail finally opened up into a clearing. In the center stood an old stone foundation, what might have once been a small cabin or outbuilding. Moss covered most of the stones, suggesting it had been abandoned for decades. As I approached the ruins, I noticed something unsettling. There was a backpack leaning against one of the walls, not ancient, but modern. It looked remarkably similar to my own pack, same brand, same dark green color. A chill ran through me as I moved closer. I didn't touch it. Something told me not to. Instead, I looked around the clearing for other signs of the pack's owner. That's when I noticed another trail leading away from the ruins, with another cairn marking its entrance. It was getting late, and I was genuinely worried now. I decided to follow this new trail, hoping it might lead back to civilization. The cairns continued, and I walked quickly, watching the daylight begin to fade through the trees. Just as I was considering finding a place to hunker down for the night, a terrifying prospect without proper gear, the trail took a sharp turn, and suddenly I was standing at the wooden bridge. The same bridge I had crossed hours ago, the halfway point of the Pinecrest Trail. Relief flooded through me. I practically ran the remaining 3 miles back to the trailhead, reaching my car just as darkness was falling. My watch read 7:30 p.m. I had been in the woods for over 10 hours on what should have been a 4-hour hike at most. When I got home, I immediately looked up maps of the state forest, searching for birch groves or stone ruins. There was nothing. I even called the ranger station the next day, asking about possible side trails or historical structures in the area. The ranger seemed confused by my questions and assured me there were no ruins documented within 10 miles of the Pinecrest Trail. I haven't been back yet. I tell myself it was just a simple case of taking a wrong turn and getting disoriented. But that doesn't explain the lost time or how I ended up back on the main trail without backtracking. And sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep, I think about that backpack in the clearing. and I wonder if someone else once took a wrong turn on a familiar trail and never found their way back. The unexplained apparition. I saw a figure in the forest, but was it real? I'm not someone who believes in the paranormal. I'm a geology graduate student, for crying out loud. I deal in rocks and science, not ghosts and spectral encounters. But something happened to me 3 weeks ago that I still can't explain, and it's been driving me crazy. I was doing some night photography in Hemming State Forest. It's about an hour's drive from campus, and it has minimal light pollution, making it perfect for star photography. I've been there plenty of times before, always sticking to the main trails even at night. I had my headlamp, a fully charged phone, and my camera gear. Nothing about this trip was different from the others. It was a clear night with a 3/4 moon, providing enough natural light that I only needed my headlamp occasionally. I had set up my tripod at one of the lookout points that gives a clear view of the valley and the night sky. I was about halfway through my planned shots when I decided to move to a different location about a 1/4 mile down the trail. As I walked, I turned off my headlamp to let my eyes adjust to the moonlight. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of nocturnal animals. The moon cast long shadows from the trees across the path, creating a complex pattern of light and dark. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead of me on the trail, a figure was standing motionless. In the moonlight, I could make out the silhouette of what appeared to be a person, adult-sized, standing upright. They weren't moving or walking, just standing there, as if waiting. My first thought was that it was another hiker or photographer. I called out, "Hello there." My voice seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet forest, but the figure didn't respond or move. I felt a prickle of unease, but told myself not to be ridiculous. It was probably just someone enjoying the night forest like I was. Maybe they didn't hear me. I started walking again, moving closer. When I was about 30 yards away, I called out again. Still no response. I squinted, trying to make out details, but the moonlight and shadows made it difficult. The figure seemed to be wearing dark clothing, and they were just standing there, facing my direction. I stopped walking, that sense of unease growing stronger. "Are you okay?" I called, louder this time. "Do you need help?" That's when it happened. The figure moved for the first time, but not in any way I expected. It didn't turn or walk away. Instead, it seemed to flicker, like a television with poor reception. One moment it was there, solid and unmistakable, and the next it seemed transparent, with the trees behind it visible. Then it was solid again. I froze, trying to process what I was seeing. It had to be a trick of the light, the moonlight shifting through the trees, creating an illusion. I blinked hard and looked again. The figure was gone, completely vanished. I stood there for what felt like minutes, my heart pounding. Then I switched on my headlamp and pointed it down the trail. There was nothing there, no person, no animal, nothing that could have been mistaken for a human figure. The trail was empty, all the way to the bend about 60 yards ahead. I'm not ashamed to admit I packed up my gear quickly and got out of there. As I hurried back to my car, I kept my headlamp on and tried to come up with rational explanations. Maybe it was another hiker who stepped off the trail right after that strange flickering effect. Maybe it was an oddly shaped tree that only looked human from a distance, and the flickering was just branches moving in a light breeze. But here's the thing, there was no breeze that night. The air was completely still, and I know what I saw was human-shaped and standing in the middle of the trail, not off to the side where a tree might be. When I got home, I researched the history of Hemming's Forest, wondering if there were any stories or legends attached to the area. Most of what I found was just the standard history. It was logged in the early 1900s, became a state forest in the 1950s, and has been a popular recreation area ever since. However, I did find one small news article from 1973 about a hiker who went missing in the forest. Thomas Wheeler, aged 32, had gone for a solo night hike and never returned. After a week-long search, authorities found his camera and backpack near one of the trails, but no other trace of him was ever discovered. The article didn't specify which trail, and I have no reason to think it was connected to what I saw. but the coincidence of a disappearance during a night hike has stuck with me. I've gone back to the forest twice since then, but only during daylight hours. I've walked that same section of trail, looking for anything unusual, an oddly shaped tree, a reflective surface that might create an illusion, anything that could explain what I saw. There's nothing. I still don't believe in ghosts. I'm sure there's a scientific explanation for what I experienced. Maybe it was an exhaustion-induced hallucination, though I wasn't particularly tired. Maybe it was some kind of rare atmospheric phenomenon. But until I find an explanation that truly fits, the memory of that flickering figure standing in the moonlight continues to haunt me. The night of unusual howls. The howls in the forest that left me questioning everything. I've been backpacking solo for about 8 years now, and I've spent more nights in the wilderness than I can count. I've heard all the normal sounds of the forest at night. The hoot of owls, the rustle of small mammals, the occasional distant howl of coyotes or wolves depending on where I am. Last summer, though, I heard something in the Adirondack backcountry that I still can't explain. I was 3 days into a 5-day trek, following a remote trail that sees maybe a dozen hikers a week. I had set up camp about 50 yards off the trail near a small stream, all properly permitted and following leave no trace principles. It was late August, and the weather was perfect, warm days and cool nights with clear skies. That particular night, I'd made dinner, just rehydrated pasta, hung my food bag on a tree away from my tent, and settled in to read a bit before sleep. It was around 10 p.m. when I first heard it. A howl echoed through the forest, and initially, I thought nothing of it. Eastern coyotes are common in the area, and hearing them is part of the wilderness experience. But as I listened, I realized this howl was off somehow. It was too deep for a coyote, more resonant, with a timbre I'd never heard before. It wasn't quite a wolf howl either, though it was closer to that. I put down my book and listened more carefully. The howl came again, longer this time, with an unusual modulation in the middle, almost like a shift in gears. It rose in pitch, then dropped suddenly before rising again. I've heard hundreds of coyote and wolf howls in the wild and in nature documentaries, and none of them do that. A few minutes later, there was a response from a different direction, similar in its strange quality, but higher pitched. Then a third joined in from yet another direction. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The calls were coming from all around my campsite. I tried to estimate distances based on the sound. The first howl seemed to be coming from about half a mile to the northwest, the second from maybe a quarter mile to the east, the third from the south, possibly closer. They called back and forth for about 20 minutes, and it seemed like they were communicating in some deliberate way. The rhythm was what really got to me. Natural wolf or coyote howls have a certain random quality to them. These had a pattern, 3 long calls followed by 2 short ones, then silence for exactly the same amount of time before repeating. It was too precise, too structured. Around 11 p.m., the howls changed. They started to sound like they were moving, circling my position. The one from the northwest seemed to shift to the north, the one from the east moved southeast, and so on. The circle was tightening. I'm not easily spooked, but I found myself checking that my knife was within reach and adding wood to my small campfire. The rational part of my brain suggested it might be some kind of territorial display, or perhaps even other campers playing a prank, though I hadn't seen anyone else for 2 days. By midnight, the howls seemed much closer, maybe a couple hundred yards away at most. I could now hear subtleties in the sounds that I couldn't before. There was a raspy quality to them, almost mechanical at times, and they were loud enough that I could feel them resonating in my chest. Then abruptly they stopped. The sudden silence was almost more unnerving than the howls. I sat perfectly still, straining to hear anything. Footsteps, breathing, movement in the underbrush, but there was nothing, just the normal sounds of the forest at night, which now seemed too quiet by comparison. I'd love to say I was brave enough to investigate, but the truth is, I stayed put in my campsite, kept my fire going all night, and barely slept. Nothing approached my camp, at least nothing I could see or hear. When dawn finally came, I did walk in a wide circle around my campsite looking for tracks or any other signs of whatever made those sounds. I found nothing unusual, no unfamiliar paw prints, no scraps of fur on branches, nothing. I finished my trek as planned, and when I got back to civilization, I spent hours researching animal sounds online. I found nothing that matched what I'd heard. I even contacted a biologist friend who specializes in predator ecology. When I described the sounds and the unusual pattern, she suggested it might have been a combination of animals, perhaps coyotes interacting with something else, their calls distorting as they echoed through the forest terrain. That's the most rational explanation I've found, but it doesn't fully account for the precision of the pattern or the way the sounds seem to deliberately circle my position. I've been back to the Adirondacks several times since then, though not to that exact area. Part of me wants to return to that same spot to see if I can hear those sounds again. But a larger part of me is reluctant, unsure if I really want confirmation of whatever was out there in the dark, calling with a voice that shouldn't exist, moving with a purpose I couldn't comprehend. The hidden clearing. I discovered a mysterious clearing in the forest. What does it mean? I found something strange in the woods last April, and I haven't told many people about it because honestly it sounds crazy. But it's been 6 months now, and I still think about it almost daily. I live in rural New England, in a town surrounded by dense forests. Most of these woods are well mapped and frequently hiked, but there are still patches that see very few visitors. I work from home as a software developer, and hiking is my way of unwinding after staring at screens all day. There's one particular forest about 20 minutes from my house that I've been exploring for years. It's mostly private land, but the owner is an elderly man who doesn't mind locals using it as long as they're respectful. There are no official trails, just game paths and old logging roads that have grown over. On this day in April, I was following one of these faint paths that I'd never fully explored before. It was heading roughly northeast, deeper into the forest than I usually go. The trees were still mostly bare, with just the beginning of spring buds, making it easier to see through the forest than it would be in summer. After about an hour of walking, the path became increasingly faint until it disappeared completely. I was about to turn back when I noticed what looked like a thinner section of trees ahead. Curious, I kept going, pushing through some underbrush until suddenly the forest opened up into a clearing. It was perfectly circular, about 30 yards across, and completely unexpected. In New England, clearings like this usually mean there was once a structure there, or it was used for agriculture. But this was miles from any road or known historical settlement. What made it truly strange, though, was what was in the clearing. In the exact center was a pattern of stones arranged in a circle. There were 13 stones in total, each about the size of a basketball, spaced evenly around a larger, flatter stone in the center. The stones weren't just randomly placed, they were partially buried, firmly set into the ground, suggesting they had been there for a very long time. But here's where it gets weird. The grass in the clearing was short, almost like it had been mowed, while the surrounding forest floor was covered in the normal leaf litter and beginning spring growth. And there was a perfect circle of white mushrooms surrounding the stone arrangement. A fairy ring, as they're sometimes called. I'm a rational person. I know fairy rings are just a natural phenomenon caused by how mycelium grows underground, and stone circles can be explained by anything from indigenous structures to colonial-era property markers to bored teenagers from 50 years ago. But the combination, plus the unusually maintained nature of the clearing, gave me an uneasy feeling. I took a few photos with my phone and then approached the stones for a closer look. The central stone had something carved into its surface, weathered by time but still visible. It looked like a simple spiral pattern circling inward. Again, this could be explained rationally, perhaps a boundary marker with a surveyor's symbol, or even natural weathering that just happened to look like a spiral. As I was examining the carving, I noticed something else odd. The clearing was completely silent. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals, no distant sounds of civilization. Just absolute stillness. It was midday in spring. The forest should have been alive with sound. I'm not superstitious, but something about that silence made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I decided I'd seen enough and should head back before I lost too much daylight. As I turned to leave, I noticed something at the edge of the clearing that I had somehow missed when I entered. A small stone structure, like a miniature doorway made of flat stones stacked and balanced against each other. It was about 2 feet high with a triangular opening. Again, rational explanations exist. People build little stone structures in the woods all the time. But combined with everything else, it felt significant somehow, like I had stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to see. I took a few more photos and marked the location on my phone's GPS. Then I left, finding my way back to the faint path and eventually to my car. When I got home, I researched the area's history, looking for any mention of stone structures or unusual clearings in that forest. I found nothing specific, though I did learn that the region had been inhabited by indigenous peoples for thousands of years before European settlement, and there were documented ceremonial stone sites throughout New England. I also asked a few older locals if they knew anything about stone structures in those woods. One elderly woman, a lifelong resident, mentioned that when she was a child in the 1950s, her grandfather had warned her and her siblings never to go deep into those particular woods. He never said why, just that some places weren't meant for wandering through. A week later, I tried to find the clearing again. I followed the same path, using my GPS coordinates as a guide, but after hours of searching, I couldn't locate it. The coordinates led me to a dense section of forest with no clearing in sight. I expanded my search area, walking in widening circles, but found nothing resembling what I had seen. I've gone back 3 more times since then, with the same result. I've shown the photos to a few friends. They agreed it was strange, but suggested ordinary explanations. An old house foundation, a spiritual or ceremonial site created by someone in recent decades, or even private property that's maintained occasionally by the owner. The photos clearly show the stone circle and the mushroom ring, exactly as I remembered them. But they don't capture the silence or the feeling of the place, like time moved differently there, like the clearing existed somewhat apart from the forest around it. I'm still trying to find a rational explanation for what I found, and why I haven't been able to locate it again. Maybe my GPS malfunctioned. Maybe I took a wrong turn when trying to find it again. Or maybe, just maybe, some places in the woods only reveal themselves once, for reasons we don't understand.